I recently caught up with Dr. Michelle Greve at Aarhus University in Denmark, who has a paper out in Early View in the Journal of Ecology on explaining continental scale browser diversity across Africa. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Michelle Greve. I'm a researcher at Aarhus University. I'm really South African, but I've been in Denmark now for 4 years. I'm currently busy with a postdoc. Yeah.
What problem was your study trying to solve, or what motivated your study?
We were really interested in African phytogeography, so the distribution and diversity patterns of African plants. And it's a field that hasn't been that well explored, mainly because of a paucity of data. So there are a few studies that have looked at species richness patterns of, for example, all African plants, but they usually just use a very small subset of the African species, just because there isn't so much data available. So we wanted to map a group of African plants with high resolution data. And for this reason, we mapped the distribution and diversity patterns of the African acacias. I should add that the African acacias were recently, or a few years ago, divided into two different genera called Vachellia and Senegalia now. And so we mapped the distribution patterns of these and then also the diversity patterns. And then we were interested in what drives the diversity patterns of the African acacias. Most species richness studies have found that climatic factors, mainly water and energy, or productivity factors, drive species richness patterns at large spatial scales of both plants and animals. And so we sort of assumed that acacias would also follow this pattern. But when we mapped their diversity patterns, and then the drivers, climate actually played a very small role in predicting their diversity patterns. So we looked into other possible factors that could drive acacia richness. We included past climatic changes, because those have shown to affect other groups of plants and animals in their diversity patterns. And then we also included the diversity of large mammalian browsers, mainly because the biology of African acacias is very much influenced by the by large mammalian browsers. So one can actually say that their biology is characterized by adaptations to browsers. For example, they have thorns, they have plasticity in a number of factors. In response to browsing, for example, they can increase their thorn spacing or thorn length. They increase branch spacing when they're browsed. They have chemical defenses, which they induce when they're browsed. And so we included browser diversity as a biotic interaction, thinking that maybe it also could predict diversity patterns of acacias.
Could you briefly explain what you found in your studies, if you had one or two bullet points?
We found that African acacia diversity, for both genera, is mainly driven by browser diversity. For Vachellia, environmental factors played a small role. For Senegalia, environment played no role in driving diversity patterns. And then past climatic changes also didn't affect the diversity patterns of the genus or genera.
Can you explain how you determined that browser richness was important in driving richness in the two acacia genera?
We used a method called partial regression analysis, and with this method one can attribute the amount of variation explained by different unique factors and then also a combination of factors. So we could determine the amount of variation uniquely ascribed to browser diversity, to climatic factors, and to past climatic changes. And then also the variation where we can't really tell which of the three factors it is. And so we could identify the unique contribution of browser diversity and all the other factors to acacia diversity.
So in the paper, you proposed a number of possible reasons for correlations between mammalian browser richness and acacia richness. Can you walk us through these reasons?
We weren't able to explore what exactly the reasons are, but as you said, we proposed some theories. One is through an evolutionary arms race. So, for example, the acacias evolve thorns to deal with the browsers, and the browsers then evolve adaptations to be able to feed on acacia despite the thorns. But because many acacia species are browsed upon by several browsers, and also browsers don't only feed on acacias, but also on other tree species, this is probably not a very good mechanism. One other possibility is through reduced fitness. It's very well known that browsing decreases the fitness of acacias. For example, acacias will produce fewer pods when browsed, and if they're very heavily browsed, then they actually remain stunted, so they don't even really reach an adult phase and they don't produce pods at all. And this can have one of two consequences. First of all, it decreases gene flow, and this can promote speciation by genetic drift or specialization to local conditions. It can also reduce competition between trees if they're very under very heavy browsing, and this could result in allopatrically evolved species to coexist after secondary dispersal.
So you mentioned in the discussion that ecologists often argue that plants drive herbivore diversity, whereas you seem to argue in the paper for the opposite mechanistic direction. Could you talk about this a little bit?
Well, not many people have explored to what extent biotic interactions do drive large-scale species richness patterns, and the few that have explored these relationships have been found in systems where it's more likely that plant diversity drives herbivore diversity. But in this particular case, we don't think it's the case. It's that way around. We think it's the other way around, for the reason that browsers, as I mentioned, browsers will feed on several different acacia species, and one acacia species will be fed upon by different browsers. So we don't think that acacias will could actually drive the diversity of browsers.
So you've talked a lot about sort of richness, but what about abundance? Do you think a browser abundance can play a role in driving the acacia richness?
Yeah, I think that abundance is maybe the missing link in our paper. Of course, if you find correlations, diversity correlations between two taxa, is actually difficult to ascertain what in that correlation is driving why the richness of one group will drive the richness of another group. And well, I think it is through abundance. So I think that increased browser diversity would also correlate with increased browser abundance, and this could then bring about diversification in the acacias. But it's something that hasn't been explored, at least not at large scales. Yeah.
Right. I wonder if it could be sort of a saturating or sort of non-linear thing, because like increased browser abundance would be maybe good for diversity of acacias, but then if they're too abundant, wouldn't they hit the populations too hard? And then,
well, I think there's really two things here. First of all, I think there's a loss of an evolutionary mechanism. So if the browsers are lost from the environment, we actually lose the mechanism by which the diversification of acacias takes place. But from more local scale data, we also know that there are some acacia species that are particularly well adapted to dealing with browsers. So if they are in areas that are very heavily browsed, other species might be able to survive in these areas given the climatic conditions and soil conditions. But because of the very heavy browsing pressure, they will not be able to exist in these species, and then acacias come in, or at least these acacia species will come in and occupy the areas. But then if the browsers are removed from the areas, the acacias lose their competitive advantage. So I do think that the loss of browsers will actually also result in the disappearance of at least the acacia species that are very well adapted to dealing with browsers.
So how general do you think the results of your study are? In what cases would you expect the same or different patterns?
Well, it depends which field you're talking about. I think this paper is at least seminal in the field of African phytogeography. As I said, it's one of the first papers that's mapped very accurately the distribution of a group of plants for the whole continent. But I also think in the macroecological field, it's an important paper showing that biotic interactions are really important at large spatial scales, and that these processes that we can see at local scales, for example, in this case where browsers have such a strong effect on the biology of acacias, that it's something that can actually scale up to continental scales and be reflected in something like diversity patterns.
So what do you think the consequences are for the field of this paper?
I hope to. I think now that we've mapped the distribution patterns of the African acacia, there's a lot that can be done with these data. And what I'm particularly interested in looking at, I'm not doing at the moment, but I hope it'll still happen in the future, is looking at the distribution and diversity of the traits of African acacia trees. They have a variety or a large variety of traits, both between species and within species. So, for example, thorn size can, in some species, can vary from a few millimeters to over 30 centimeters, or at least over 20 centimeters within a species. And I'm very much interested to what extent this is genetic and versus induced by local pressures, so induced by plasticity to browsers.
So what was the most challenging part of the study?
Getting hold of the data, definitely. Yeah, I had a lot of locality records, and I really wouldn't have been able to do this without input of my co-authors and also a lot of herbaria, just people who have been gathering this kind of data. Yeah, but it took me a long time to get all the data together, and also spent a lot of time in herbaria myself, databasing the information and then georeferencing, so putting locality or GPS coordinates to the locality records, which took me a very long time, and it's quite tedious. But it also allowed me to sort of pore over maps of Africa, or Google Maps of Africa and other gazetteers, and was actually quite fascinating. I learned a lot about the African landscape, and yeah, it was interesting all the same.